Hello everyone. In this class, we'll briefly learn about thalamus. The learning objective of this class would be to name major nuclear groups in the thalamus and give their functions, appreciate the functional organization of thalamus, list the functions of thalamus, correlate the functions of thalamus with thalamic dysfunction, give the structure and functions of epithalamus and subthalamus. Thalamus is an egg-shaped nuclear structure sitting obliquely atop the brain stem. It, it is known as the sensory relay station. It receives ascending sensory inputs and projects them to the sensory cortical areas. Afferent fibers of ascending reticular formation also project to the thalamus, and thalamus receives input from cortex, mainly from the layer 6. There are two thalami on both the sides. Anteriorly, they are separated by a third ventricle, and the corpora quadrigemina is present between their posterior parts. So this is the three divisions of thalamus. It is divided into anterior, medial and lateral part, which is divided by the internal medullary lamina. Thalamic nuclei. The thalamus is composed of a number of discrete nuclei, thalamocortical and corticothalamic fibers from external medullary lamina that covers the lateral surface of the thalamus and passes between the reticular nucleus and the rest of the thalamus. Anatomically, a Y-shaped internal medullary lamina splits thalamus into three parts. These are anterior, medial, and lateral group of nuclei. The anterior group of nuclei is enclosed by bifurcation of the internal medullary lamina. The medial group of nuclei consists of medial nucleus, midline nucleus, centromedian, and interlaminar nucleus. Lateral group of nuclei is further divided into dorsal and ventral nuclear groups of nuclei. The dorsal nuclear group contains lateral posterior nucleus, lateral dorsal nucleus, and pulvinar nucleus. The ventral nuclear group is comprised of ventral anterior, ventral lateral, and ventral posterior nuclei and medial and lateral geniculate bodies. The ventral posterior group, also known as ventrobasal complex, consists of ventroposterolateral and ventroposteromedian groups of nuclei. However, physiologically there are four groups of nuclei. So these are the different groups of nuclei. You can see the anterior, the medial and lateral group of nuclei. The lateral group of nuclei, they are again divided into ventroanterior, ventrolateral, ventroposterolateral, dorsal lateral, posterior lateral. Then you have pulvinar nucleus, where you have lateral geniculate and medial geniculate bodies. Okay, and this shows also their functional aspects. That is, these nuclei, they're connected to spinothalamic pathway and VPL to the dorsal column pathway. Medial geniculate body is for audition, and lateral geniculate body is associated with vision. So again, thalamus is divided into three important parts: anterior, medial, lateral. Anterior, we have an anterior nucleus. In the medial, we have medial dorsal nucleus. The lateral is largely divided into lateral group and ventral group. In the lateral, you have lateral dorsal, lateral posterior, pulvinar nuclei, and in the ventral group, we have ventral anterior nucleus, ventral lateral nucleus, and ventral posterior nucleus. Ventral posterior nucleus further divided into ventral posterior medial nucleus and ventral posterolateral nucleus. So coming to the physiological divisions or functions, first one is specific relay nuclei. The thalamus acts as a specific relay nuclei, assigning afferent inputs synapse on these nuclei. The axons arising from them transmit the afferent impulse to the cortex. This nuclear group consists of ventrobasal complex, lateral geniculate body, medial geniculate body, and anterior nucleus. The ventrobasal complex receives input from dorsal column pathway, anterolateral system, and corticothalamic fibers and projects to the somatosensory cortex. The trigeminal lemniscus carries these sensations from face along with gustatory afferent and project to the ventroposterior nucleus that transmits the afferent inputs to the postcentral gyrus. The lateral geniculate body receives input from optic tract and projects to visual cortex, whereas medial geniculate body receives input from auditory pathway and projects to auditory cortex. The anterior nucleus receives input from hypothalamus through mammillothalamic tract and relays the information to the cingulate gyrus. The second function is association nuclei. This nuclear group consists of pulvinar, dorsal nuclei, and lateral posterior nucleus. These nuclei receive inputs from sensory cortex and limbic system and project diffusely to the association cortex or to subcortical structures. The pulvinar projects to the inferior parietal lobe. The dorsolateral nucleus is reciprocally connected to the precuneate gyrus. Then it has a non-specific nuclei. These include interlaminar, midline, and centromedian nuclei and reticular nuclei. They receive inputs mainly from reticular formation and paleospinothalamic tract and also inputs from striatum, hypothalamus, and other thalamic nuclei. They project diffusely to wide area of cerebral cortex, to thalamus, and to the limbic system. Then the motor part, motor nuclei. These include lateral and ventral anterior and ventral lateral nuclei. The ventral lateral nucleus receives input from the cerebellum through the dentatorubro-thalamic tract and projects to the motor cortex area 4 and 6. The ventral anterior nucleus receives input from basal ganglia and projects to the premotor cortex. The thalamic nuclei are also divided into extrinsic and intrinsic nuclei. The specific relay nuclei are known as extrinsic nuclei and rest others as intrinsic nuclei. It should be noted that all somatosensory information reaches all these different types of thalamic nuclei. So this is the diagrammatic representation of the connections of thalamus. It is connected to the cerebral cortex to and fro. It is connected to the basal nuclei where it is going to receive information. The cerebellum sends its signals, mainly exteroceptive and proprioceptive impulses through the medial lemniscus, spinothalamic tract, and trigeminothalamic tract. And it also receives visceral impulses from the reticular formation and taste. It is going to receive information from the vision and hearing through medial and lateral geniculate bodies. It is extensively connected to the hypothalamus and as amygdaloid complex as well. So here you can see the connections and functions of a different major thalamic nuclei. As we know that functionally they are specific nuclei and non-specific nuclei. The specific nuclei are lateral ventral cortex and posteroventral, dorsal lateral, and lateral and medial geniculate bodies. So they have the lateral ventral cortex. The major afferents are dentatothalamic tract and pallido-thalamic tract, whereas it gives efferents to the thalamocortical tract. and mainly it has a proprioceptive input to the control of voluntary movements. Posterolateral nuclei it receives information from spinothalamic fibers, trigeminothalamic fibers, and medial lemniscus, whereas it gives reference to its sensory cortex. Okay, so this is the relay center for all the somatosensory output, including the face. Whereas dorsolateral and pulvinar, they receive information from the parietal cortex, temporal and occipital lobe, and they give its reference to the parietal lobe, temporal and occipital lobe. They are involved in the language and speech. They integrate somatic, auditory, and visual information as well. The geniculate bodies they receive information from the optic tract and the cochlea and inferior colliculi, and they give their efferents to visual cortex and auditory cortex. Their important function is vision and audition. Whereas non-specific nuclei they include anterior, midline, interlaminar, dorsomedial uh, nuclei, and anterior group receives information from mammillothalamic tract, sends information to the cingulate gyrus, and it is involved in memory and emotion. Whereas midline group they receive information from all ascending fibers from hypothalamus and reticular formation, and they send signals to mainly the neocortex, basal ganglia, and hypothalamus. They are involved in integration of somatic and visceral sensation, and they're important for arousal. Interlaminar nuclei they receive information from RAS basal ganglia. They send signals to the neocortex and prefrontal cortex. They're mainly involved in arousal and motor functions. Whereas dorsomedial nuclei they receive information from the hypothalamus and prefrontal cortex, and they give information to the prefrontal cortex. They are associated with a crude somatic sensation. Thalamic organization and their functions. The ascending somatosensory pathways terminate in certain thalamic nuclei. The sensory signals mostly arise from contralateral receptors of the body. Axon from the cells in the dorsal column nuclei crosses the brainstem immediately at the level of medulla and travel in the contralateral medial lemniscus to terminate primarily in the ventroposterolateral nucleus, VPL nucleus of the thalamus. The fibers of anterolateral system, that is lateral and anterior spinothalamic tract, travel in the contralateral anterolateral funiculus of the spinal cord to terminate in the ventroposterolateral and posterior and interlaminar nuclei. Reticulothalamic fibers of the spino-reticulothalamic pathway remains largely uncrossed and terminate in intermediate, midline or centromedian nuclei and in the thalamic reticular nuclei. The ventroposterolateral and posterior project to the cortical regions. Intermediate diffusely project to the cortex, and reticular nuclei is reciprocally connected with other thalamic nuclei. Posterolateral nucleus, that is VPL nucleus. The VPL receives input from many ascending sensory pathways. Each pathway has a typical pattern of termination in VPL nucleus. The central core of VPL nucleus receives largely cutaneous inputs. The dorsal aspects of VPL receives mostly the deep inputs, whereas anterior surface receives muscle inputs. Thus, the VPL consists of a core cutaneous inputs and shell of deep inputs. The afferent fibers from face, arm, and leg are represented in the medial to lateral manner in the VPL nucleus. Posterior nuclei. Posterior nuclei receives nociceptive inputs. Cells in the posterior nuclei respond to a variety of somatic and non-somatic modalities. Posterior nucleus is mainly involved in transmission of nociceptive impulses. Large lesion in posterior nucleus produces analgesia, and stimulation of posterior nucleus produces pain sensation. However, there is no somatotropic organization in posterior nucleus. Then interlaminar nuclei and reticular nuclei. Cells in the interlaminar nuclei have a large somatic receptive fields. They are activated by nociceptive and other stimuli. Responses in intermediate nuclei are strongly affected by the level of arousal, attention, and affect. Cells in the reticular nuclei respond to a variety of somatosensory modalities. Intermediate nuclei has a diffuse but strong projection to the cortex, striatum, and limbic system. Reticular nuclei does not project to the cortex but reciprocally connected to the other thalamic nuclei. Thus, reticular nuclei involved in the modulation of thalamic activity. Coming to the functions of thalamus, all afferent impulses on their way to the sensory cortex terminate in the thalamus. So it mainly acts as a relay station for all somatic sensations. Thalamus conveys the sensory information to the cortex through thalamocortical projections. Thus, it is a major relay station for sensory inputs in human and higher order animals, whereas in lower order animals, it acts as the center for sensory integration. Involved in relay in special sensation. Thalamus is a relay center for all special sensation except olfaction. The lateral and medial geniculate bodies receive the visual and auditory afferents respectively. The ventroposterior lateral nucleus receives the taste afferents. It is involved in arousal mechanism. Thalamocortical projects from non-specific nuclei to the cortex contributes to reticular activating system that activates arousal mechanisms and keep the individual awake. Subcortical perception of sensation. Subcortical perception of pain, temperature, pressure occurs to some extent in thalamus. Thalamus is not only the relay station but also the integration center for these sensations. Therefore, these sensations remain intact considerably in cortical region. They have a motor functions. Thalamus is an integral part of the motor loop of the brain in which globus pallidus of basal ganglia projects mainly to the VPL nucleus of thalamus via pallidothalamic tract, and thalamus projects to the motor cortex via thalamocortical fibers which projects back to the basal ganglia. Through motor loop, thalamus influences the postural movements. Thalamus also links cerebellum and motor cortex via dentatorubrothalamocortical tract. Through this connection, thalamus influences planning and programming of movements. It is involved in memory and emotion. Anterior thalamus is constituent of Pepys circuit. It receives input from mammillary body of limbic system via mammillothalamic tract. Through this connection, thalamus is concerned with a recent memory and emotion. It is important for synchronization of EEG. Stimulation of interlaminar thalamic nuclei at low frequency causes synchronization of EEG waves recorded from the ipsilateral cortex. This is called as recruiting response. However, high frequency stimulation causes arousal and desynchronization. It has a role in sleep. A circuit linking the thalamus and cortex, that is thalamocortical loop, is important in generating the pattern of brain activity in sleep-wake cycle. Inhibitory thalamic reticular neurons are proposed to be the part of this neuronal network that causes induction of sleep. It is also involved in sensory motor coordination. Thalamus receives all sensory inputs from the body and closely interacts with basal ganglia, cerebellum, and motor cortex. Therefore, thalamus is one of the major structures in the brain for coordination between sensory and motor functions, especially in the sensory feedback for correction and improvement in the motor output. It is also important for language and sleep. Dorsal lateral nucleus of the thalamus is reciprocally connected with the parietal lobe of the brain and therefore is concerned with language and speech and complex integrated functions. Some of the applied aspects related to the thalamus, so which is uh, thalamic syndrome, so which occurs because of the lesion of the ventroposterolateral uh, and which in turn occurs because of the thrombosis of the posterolateral branch of the posterior cerebral artery. This results in severe impairment of discriminative touch and pressure sensation of contralateral side, whereas diffuse touch, temperature, and pain sensation are often less impaired. Also, there occurs decreased muscle tone, profound weakness of the muscles, and ataxia as VPL nucleus receives afferent impulses from cerebellum and relays them to the motor cortex area 4 and 6. The emotion may be affected. This is called as thalamic syndrome. Vascular lesions usually spare the medial thalamus, including BPM nuclear group. Therefore, sensation in the face and head often remain intact. The other deficits when thalamus is damaged, uh, not only it leads to thalamic function loss, but also mainly the cortical functions are affected. The cortex is intimately connected with thalamus. Electrical lesion of the interlaminar nuclei relieves chronic suffering type of pain, though the acute perception of the pain remains intact. So this is regarding the thalamus. There are different nuclei and different functions of thalamus, some of the applied aspects related to it. Thank you.